Hello and welcome to the Book Club Review. I'm Kate.
I'm Laura, and this is the podcast about the books that get people talking.
We've unpacked our suitcases, shaken the sand off our feet, and are back together again, ready to dive into a post-summer bookshelf episode, where we'll be sharing the highs and hopefully not too many lows of our summer reading.
We're also celebrating our 5th anniversary of the Book Club Review. That's right, we now have 5 whole years, 5, under our belt as podcasters. It's both a milestone for us and a prompt to consider where we've got to, where we're going, and what's set to change. In fact, you may have already noticed a little something different about this episode.
All will be explained here on the Book Club Review. We're back after a short summer hiatus and desperate to dive straight into book chat after weeks of happy holiday reading. But first, regular listeners may be wondering about that new music.
That's right, listeners. We have our very own brand new theme music to take us into a new, same but different era of the Book Club Review.
Long-time listeners will know that it all started with our book clubs and the frank, often funny, sometimes fierce discussions that result when you bring passionate readers together. It's those discussions that fill our boots and that boisterous dynamic we've always tried to recreate on the show. As we've always said, love the book, loathe the book, so much the better.
Now, 5 years in, and with over 125 episodes under our belt, we took some time this summer to take stock of what matters to us and where we want to take our listeners next. What does that mean in practice? In short, more of the same, but with a sharper focus. Every month, we'll bring you 3 episodes: a bookshelf episode, a close-up interview, and a book club episode.
On Bookshelf, it's all about what we've been reading for ourselves, the books we get to pick and choose following our own whims and fancies. These episodes are our guilty pleasure, and the listener numbers tell us that you're pretty big fans too.
On close-up episodes, Kate will be digging in with authors, publishers, and other bookish folk to ask the questions real readers want to know. All that, but still keeping with the book club vibe, with plenty of book recommendations to help you figure out what to read next.
And finally, our book club episodes. Closest to our hearts, these episodes began as a chance to share our own book club's discussions and debate. Now we're broadening out their scope, inviting other readers into the discussion and onto the show. We'll still dip into the latest books read by our book clubs, but just as often we'll be convening live book clubs to read, review and debate the latest prize shortlist, summer must-read or literary classic.
New music, new focus. What else is new?
We are launching a Patreon account. For the first time, you'll be able to support us and help us make the show even better. We're keeping it simple to start with, but I'm already so excited at the possibilities. You'll be supporting us, and believe me when I say your financial support will make a big difference. But I can also see how Patreon is going to give us new opportunities to share with you, including reading guides and book recommendations, as well as the chance to discuss books directly with us. Bear with us while we work out the details, but expect to hear more in coming episodes.
I am excited about all those things. Can we talk about the books now?
I'm dying to talk about books. It's been such a long summer. I've missed you. I've missed talking books with you.
I feel like you've had a real summer. There were a couple weeks in Italy. There were a couple weeks on the east coast of England. You've been away from home for a while, living the life.
I had a real change of scene, but at the same time, it's very intense family time. You know, when I'm at home, my children are normally at school and we also have some help. So relatively speaking, I have quite a lot of time. When I'm on holiday, I don't have any of that. So it's kind of been like trying to squeeze in reading wherever I can.
I lived that this summer too. You always used to say this, that going on vacation with my family is not a holiday. And I lived that for the first time, going away with my husband and small daughter, who's almost 3, without cousins or grandparents. And what a mistake that was. It was just harder than being at home. We were also potty training, so I can't even tell you. Those holidays were quite exhausting and everyone returned very happy to be home.
The golden ratio is that you need one more adult than you have the number of children, and then you'll be fine. Can I tell you about Lonesome Dove?
I know you've been dying to.
I'm so desperate. Well, in fact, I have been talking about this book to everyone who has crossed my path. How did I come to it? I had heard here and there, every so often, someone would mention it. And the thing I knew about that was that those people always were raving about it. Whenever I saw it mentioned, it was always followed up by such an amazing book. But the thing that really sealed the deal was my mum read it for her book club. It's quite a long book. It's 830 pages. And I saw this tome on her coffee table. I said, "Oh, Lonesome Dove, why have you got that?" And she said, "Oh, we just did it for book club." I was like, "Any good?" She was like, "Yes, it was great." Okay, even my mum thinks this book is good. So I should read it. So I borrowed her copy of her. I took it away to Italy with me. It was the only book I took, merrily thinking, we went away for 2 weeks, and I was merrily thinking, great, I'll have one really, really good book to take me through that trip. And boy, did it deliver. It's set in the late 19th century. It's the kind of classic Wild West. Much of America is still being settled. You've got these two aging rangers, is what they are, Texas Rangers. It starts off on the border with Mexico, and it's dry and it's dusty, and this tiny little ramshackle place that is their place of business, the Hat Creek Trading Company. And you meet these two guys. So there's Gus McCrae and Woodrow Call. And you get a real sense of the lives that they've lived. They've had their years working as rangers, making the border safe for the settlers, establishing the border, I guess, skirmishes with Mexico, Native Americans. It's that classic story of how the West was won, I suppose, to use a phrase. But all of that happened in the past. And when we meet these guys, they're just sort of a bit restless. Not much is going on and they're bored. Not unhappy with their lot. They're actually quite contented in a way, but it's that sort of troubles them. And so they connect up with someone that they used to ride with back in the day, and he tells them about these beautiful unsettled lands in Montana and how amazing it is there. And they decide, well, one of them decides that the thing to do is to gather this herd of cattle and drive them up to Montana and to start a new life as cattle ranchers. They take with them this ragtag cast of characters. There's a terrible cook. There is a woman who has been living in this, you couldn't even call it a town, this tiny settlement, Lonesome Dove, trapped there. She's got her own story about the misadventures that befell her and the way that she ended up there. She yearns to escape. She wants to go to San Francisco. And so she ends up going along with them. And off they go. And so by the time all this has been established, I'm kind of about 300 pages in, and I'm liking it. I'm really liking it. The writing is so good. I knew from the very beginning this was going to be something that I was going to enjoy, but at the same time, I wasn't totally convinced. I kept thinking, well, when is it going to get to the point where people can't put it down? I don't feel I'm there that. I was still finding it quite put downable. And then they go through this sandstorm. It's the first real difficult thing that's happened to them as they've been driving these cattle along. It's hard to describe the brilliant way that he narrates these things. And you're kind of experiencing this sandstorm with these men. It's very cinematic. You really vividly see it all happening and feel it all happening around you as if you're there. And I suddenly was just like, oh my God, what's going to happen next? And from that point in, I was totally in. All I wanted to know was what was going to happen next. And what I loved about it is that I never knew what was going to happen next. It's very unpredictable. It's so beautifully balanced in terms of its pace and this incredible narrative drive that keeps you turning the pages. And these two main characters who at the beginning, I have to say I wasn't particularly interested in. I certainly didn't have anything in common with either of them. Didn't really care about them. And little by little, you had to get to know them. And as you do, with all their flaws, their virtues and their flaws, you start to love them, I suppose, because you become so invested in their experiences and their perspective. And there are all these other side characters that equally, even the minor characters, you still care about. He's so good at making these people live and breathe with all the complexity and diversity of human life. And I had been sort of worried that I would find it problematic, like, well, what's it going to be like in terms of the wiping out of Native American culture? What's it going to be like about this relationship with Mexico and the Mexicans? Is that going to be difficult to read? Because we look at these things now with a very different eye, and I think it's absolutely right that we do. But this was written in 1980. Lonesome Dove, and I was really surprised by how complex and nuanced a view this takes of the American West. And what I loved was the way that I felt he's telling this epic story, this classic story in a way, but at the same time, he's really interrogating that idea of the Wild West, the cowboy. Who were the real conquerors? Was it the men? Was it these cowboys, these men who claimed the land and staked their claim, imposed their will on the land? Or was it luck and happenstance? They're shown in Lonesome Dove to be completely at the mercy of forces far greater than their control, the elements. I think one thing potentially that could be problematic with this book, and I certainly think where I've read reviews by people who didn't get on with it, that was the main issue, is the way that the women are depicted in this. But I still felt it was an interesting and quite nuanced look at the role of women, and arguably the female characters are the strongest voices in the book. And I think McMurtry is suggesting that it was women who bore children and endured terrible hardships and carved out domestic spaces for their families, who really were the heroes of the story. And so for that reason, I just had so much time for it. I loved it. It's long, I love a long read, but it is long. It's 830 pages and you're like, wow, that's a lot. But I cannot tell you how much you fly through it once you get to that point where you're sort of gripped by it. And it doesn't feel like a long book then. The one problem with it, I would say, is that I was supposed to be on a family holiday looking after my children and being social with my extended family. And I just kept sneaking off to sit in corners, often quite uncomfortable corners, because they were the only places I could find where no one was around, so that I could read this book. And I couldn't really hear any conversations. I was just, it was a little bit, what's the word? That wasn't such a good aspect of it. But yeah, and I thought even for book club, I think it would be really interesting because I think it raises really interesting questions. I just loved it. I loved it. I thought it was so good.
Well, I'm sold because I love a little bit of frontier fiction, which is clearly not a term that I have made up myself, but is a real thing. Frontier fiction, right? Like Days Without End by Sebastian Barry, I would say is, for me, the introduction, although of course it comes after Lonesome Dove. Even just The Outlander by Jill Adams, which I read and discussed on Bookshelf back in early 2022, which is the Canadian frontier. I'm into it. And the fact that it's super long in some ways is appealing, right? You can just sink into it and float away.
You don't want it to end. The USA Today reviewer said the prose was as smooth as worn saddle leather, which I loved and is true. It's so assured, the writing. It's wonderful. The LA Times said Lonesome Dove is Larry McMurtry's loftiest novel, a wondrous work, drowned in love, melancholy, and yet ultimately exultant. In Lonesome Dove, McMurtry celebrates a world abundant with calamity and a human spirit wistful but prevailing, a compelling and memorable epic.
Sounds great.
But I'd love to discuss it with people because, I suspect I'm often quite swayed by things and forget to be critical. And, I would love to hear from perhaps people with a more critical eye than me and really find out more about it. I even read someone's PhD thesis on postmodern elements in Lonesome Dove, which she made a very persuasive case. I was very sold on that, the fragmentation. And the other thing that it cited, looking at his inspiration, is things like Middlemarch and War and Peace. He had those classic 19th century novels in mind. Such an interesting book.
Well, and I believe you did too, so we might have a bit more back and forth here. I read the book of the summer, Tomorrow, Tomorrow, and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin. This is a book about video games. It's the story of Sam and Sadie, who meet in hospital when they are 10, 11, 12, and they spend hours and hours and hours together over a year playing video games, and they develop this really close bond. And that narrative is also woven in from the beginning with them meeting again in Boston. Sam is now at Harvard, Sadie's at MIT. For reasons that are revealed, they haven't spoken since that year. They had a major falling out, and we don't quite know why yet. But their friendship is rekindled in university, and they set about making a computer game together. And that computer game, Ichigo, will have huge critical and commercial success. So by their early 20s, they are those quintessential university dropouts. They moved back to LA, and they have a very successful gaming company. There's been a lot of emphasis in reviews that this is a story about love, but it's not romantic love. It's a story about the love between friends. And I wish it was as clear cut as that, because I think the waters do get muddied at certain points. I would have liked the purity of that friendship love to have remained. This is a coming of age novel. They have highs, they have lows, they fall out, they come back together. I really loved the first half, and I was a bit less convinced about the second half. For me, Zevin tried to pull in too much in too short an amount of time. The first half of the novel is about their childhood and then that first year where they come together to make this game. And then the second half spans, I think it's about 10 to 15 years. And it's already quite a long book. I believe it's over 400 pages, but it lost some of its momentum. Sadie and Sam start off really likable, I would say, and they become increasingly unlikable. And I think that is fair to how they develop as characters. Perhaps it's even fair in terms of how our lives become more complex and we potentially become more complex as we get older and lose some of that naivety, simplicity of our earlier years. I have now passed this on to one of my colleagues who's in her late 20s, and I'm really interested to hear what she thinks of it. What I have to say, and I think you flagged this to me when you read it, is I loved the references to computer games of the early 90s. So Oregon Trail, yeah. I was like, yes! Oregon Trail, yes! And they talk about Myst, and they talk about Mario, and all that was super familiar to me, even though I wasn't a huge gamer. It still had all those references. Now, my colleague who's in her late 20s, she probably won't have those references. So that will be a test, I think.
That's a really interesting test, actually, litmus test, because I think you're right. I think so much of the thrill of it is the pleasure of these references to things that you remember, but no one talks about. You know, no one's discussing playing Colossal Adventure with your sister, you know, when you were both 12 or whenever it was. And actually, it really made me want to read. At the end, she cites quite a few books on the history of video games that she referred to, and actually it really made me want to read one of those. I find the whole subject is so fascinating, and I always felt like, you know, she found a really good subject. In some ways, I think it's interesting, her previous book was a YA novel. I think this has quite a lot of elements of that, in that obviously it's got the coming of age thing, and it is an adult story, but the characters don't have a ton of nuance. Sometimes I felt it was almost like a bit of a blunt instrument, but I think still I enjoyed it hugely, and I felt it was the creativity of it, the inventiveness, and this well-researched subject that made it a really good read. It's a rare thing, isn't it? A book, especially one that's had that much hype and that much marketing spend, that actually you read it and you're like, oh yeah, this is great. You know, that's just nice, isn't it? It doesn't happen very often.
Well, you know me and you know yourself. We actually respond to hype with increased criticism, and I think the fact that I would say this book is flawed, I'm not surprised that it didn't make any prize shortlists. And at the same time, I would recommend it to people and say, hey, yeah, give this one a try. It's a great read. It'll take you somewhere you didn't know you wanted to go. And it's hugely entertaining.
But that's a good point, isn't it? Would you recommend it for book club? I'm not sure I would. I don't think there's all that much to it if you were really wanting something where you could discuss it and dive into it. But as a read, great. Just a great read.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. I think if we gave it the book club treatment, I'd end up hating it. And I don't really want that.
No, let's not do that. Okay, my next one is an interesting one in that I was sent it by a listener, Molly, who really kindly and nicely got in touch on Instagram, and very occasionally people do, and it's always nice just to check in with people about what they're reading, or if they've listened to a show, you know, what they like, or, you know, responding to, you know how it works, the comments on Instagram. And then, out of the blue, she just said, could I send you a book? I really love the show. It'd be really nice to be able to send you a book. And I politely was like, oh, really inwardly just thinking, oh no, God, you know, the last thing I want is extra reading. I've got so much to read. But she seemed so nice. And so I thought, okay, I'll say yes, and it'll come, and I could just look at it, and, you know, maybe I'll get around to it. Probably I won't, but it'll be nice to have it anyway. So I said, oh, thanks, that's so nice. You know, she sent it to me, and it came, and I looked at it and didn't really think anything much of it. The night always comes. Willie Vlorton is the author, and it's got a sort of thriller-esque cover, dark, a woman looking out of a window onto a cityscape, and it's all very somber. And then idly, you know, because she'd sent it to me, I was like, at least look at this thing, you know. So I picked it up and read the first couple of pages. And let me tell you, I did not put it down again except to sleep or eat or do, necessary tasks for the next 48 hours. This is such a good read. Molly, I love that you sent me this. She was so nice as well. Then I messaged her to say how much I'd loved it. And she said, oh, that's great. I wouldn't have wanted to send you anything that I didn't think you would really like. She said she recommends it for a weekend after a heavy read. She said you can fly through it, but it won't feel like candy floss. And that's true. It's the story of Lynette, who we meet, and she is struggling. She's having a really tough time. She's working 2 jobs. She's looking after her brother Kenny, and we find out quite quickly that he has special needs. So he needs quite a lot of her attention, and physically he needs a lot of help. And even just the way that we're introduced to Kenny, the way that that's written at the beginning is brilliant. It wrong foots you. You start and you think, well, hang on a minute, what am I reading here? And then immediately it all falls into place. But it was so clever that I was just hooked from the first page because I was so interested. They both live with their mother, and she's a bit of a mess. And so quite quickly, you're really invested in Lynette. She's trying really hard. You find out that they're saving. She's got a plan that if they can save enough money, they've got the opportunity to buy this house that they're living in. And she can just scrape the money with her money and her mother's money. They can just do it. And then this fairly crummy house that they've been able to rent at a very low rate for years because of various problems with it, the basement leaks and things like that. So the arrangement they have is that the landlord won't raise the rent if they don't complain about any of the various things that are wrong with it. And finally, he wants to move on. He's prepared to sell it to them at a good price. And she knows that it's their chance to have a home of their own, which they've never had. And yet things start to go wrong, and she is forced to resort to some sort of slightly desperate measures in order to get the money that is so important to her. She's having to collect it from friends and acquaintances who owe her money, who turn out usually to be not as good as they seem. They don't want to give up money, and they usually end up trying to do her harm, and she then has to figure out ways to get what she needs, and it goes to some quite dark places, but I never wanted to stop reading it for a second. And that's interesting because I'm not someone who, generally, I'm not much of a thriller reader. I don't really enjoy tension. It's not normally something I'd seek out, but it's so brilliantly written, and the dialogue I thought was so good. When people talk to each other in this book, these are like real conversations. There's a real sense of an interchange of ideas. People explain themselves. People try and persuade other people of things. And I loved all that. And it's very propulsive and builds to this conclusion. And I shut the back cover and I was just like, whoa. I don't know anything about Willie Vlortin, but he's from Portland. It's set in Portland, and it has a real political subtext, very much about the squeezed middle, people who are working so hard, and yet even if they do everything they can, the system is stacked against them and they still won't succeed. And they are surrounded by wealth and affluence. And so in Portland, there's her area, which is basically a neighborhood that's being gentrified. So they've had the house for many years, and in that time they've seen this area, this neighborhood that they're in, change out of all recognition, and house prices have gone up. So one of the big pressures, the source of the tension about whether or not she's going to be able to buy this house, is that if she doesn't buy it now at this price, then she knows that they won't be able to buy anywhere in that neighborhood. And there are various reasons why they want to stay in that neighborhood. So, it felt like it had this really interesting, very resonant subtext. So to have all of that and this brilliant storytelling in the same package, I thought it was great. I loved it. The Night Always Comes. And when I've mentioned Willie Vlortin to other people who know him, it's one of those things about, it's kind of like if you know. People who know him love him. Apparently he's very successful in America. He's just not particularly well known here in the UK, but I want to champion him because I just thought this was great. I definitely want to read his others.
Does anyone die?
Well, I wouldn't want to spoil it.
I ask because I don't read a lot of crime because I'm not really interested in gory deaths. And I think I was forever traumatized by the girl with the dragon tattoo.
Oh, but that was such a terrible book.
It's just so disturbing and so gratuitous in its violence and violence towards women. I was, But Tana French.
That was a terrible book. This is a brilliant book.
But like thrillers that have a crime element, but the violence is, I don't know. It's not the driver. It's not like the climactic points. They're of interest to me, even though I'm a scaredy cat.
Yeah. No, I would say this falls into that category, definitely. Yeah, Dragon Tattoo. I remember that. It just felt like endless conversations about sandwiches and coffee.
All right, on to my next read, which comes with a little bit of a preface in that we will be having our book club Booker Prize shortlist episode in a few weeks' time. And so this summer, in a crazy feat of organization, Kate and I convened a WhatsApp group from the end of July with our guests, Kirsty Ryan from Book Bar and Phil Chafee, our longtime friend and contributor. So we started talking about the long list before the shortlist was announced. And so I decided, hey, let's get ahead on my required reading. And I picked out the books that I thought, well, let's be honest, it wasn't that I thought they would make the shortlist. They were the books I wanted to read. And so I read 4 of them. In fact, although I'm only going to speak to 2 today, I read Small Things Like These by Claire Keegan, which is the shortest novel ever shortlisted for the Booker. I read O. William by Elizabeth Strout, of Lucy Barton fame, Olive Kettridge. Never read an Elizabeth Strout, so dipped into that one. And then I read The Trees by Percival Everett, and I'll come to that. All 3 of those books have made the shortlist. So I'm ahead on my required reading. By luck, by chance, I don't know, maybe by taste. But the 4th book I read didn't make the shortlist, and that's not surprising to me. However, I did love it. That novel is Trust by Hernan Diaz, who has been a Pulitzer Prize finalist. I had never heard of him before. The little tagline on the inside cover says, "An unparalleled novel about money, power, intimacy, and perception." Now, because we had convened this WhatsApp group, Chrissy had read this one too, and she said, oh, I liked the first story, but the rest of it really wasn't for me. Now, she's a listener and slightly knows my reading taste, and she's like, but I think you might quite like it, Laura. And she was spot on. This is the kind of novel you don't want to say too much about because you don't want to ruin it for people. What you know from flipping past the title page is that it's a novel of 4 parts. And I should say each of those parts has a different author, in quote marks. You have no sense of how these stories are going to relate to one another. And it's actually only really cleared up what the connection is when you get to part 3. And even then, the final piece of the puzzle, you don't quite know what you're going to get until you're there. This is all a little bit obscure. And Kate, I could see you being like, yes, but what's it about? The first story is about Benjamin and Helen Rask. And Benjamin Rask is a legendary Wall Street tycoon in the 1910s, 1920s, and 1930s. And we follow him from the early days of his financial success in Wall Street to the Great Depression and the Black Thursday crash of the late 1920s. Helen, his wife, they're both very reclusive. She is a patron of the arts, but even still, she's a bit of a cipher within New York society. And her life takes a turn as that reclusiveness becomes ever more problematic. And I am being vague there with purpose. Those 2 characters, what can I say? They reappear in some ways over the next 3 parts. And I loved the literary puzzle that Hernan Diaz had created here. And at the same time, I can very much understand why people would be irritated by this structure, especially because it chucks you out of one narrative into another narrative. And usually I hate that because you're like, who are these people? Why do I care? And you have to keep reading to find out why you would care. And there is a bit of an academic tone to the exercise, but I kind of liked that. And then the thing to say is there is a lot about Wall Street and financial systems and trading and hedging. And Kate and I love a bit of Michael Lewis. So this really appealed to me, even as I didn't quite understand it. The ending is very satisfying in the way that you would really want and pulling it all together. But it isn't perfect. I understand why it didn't make the shortlist, I think, because there is this kind of coldness to how it all comes together. And the characters don't truly have that richness that you might want. There's reasons for that, not to be disclosed. Are you intrigued, Kate? Is this one that you think you would dip into?
This is the one that I was most intrigued to read. I was so sure it would make the shortlist just based on what everyone was saying about it. That's why I didn't make any effort to read it over the summer, because I just thought, well, I'll be reading that when I get around to my shortlist reading, which will be at the last minute. I will be reading that. So I was a bit annoyed that it didn't make the list, because now I won't have time to read it because I've got these 6 other books to read.
It takes a turn to a Swiss sanatorium that I think you would enjoy very much. after
We love a
reading
Swiss
Thomas Mann's.
sanatorium.
Yeah, we love
Yes.
sanatoriums. I feel like the theme
Yeah,
of
yeah, yeah.
2022 is Swiss sanatoriums. And that's not just our podcast. That's the book publishing world.
Was there something a little bit clinical about it, maybe? Or
Yeah, I think so. And it's because it's not one cohesive novel. It's a series of novels, one could argue. It's 4 literary documents, effectively, pulled together, and they complement one another to tell a full story. And I'm sure that there are some high-level theoretical postmodern strategies at play here. And that is interesting to me, even as I say, it's a bit academic. And so a lot of people might read the first story, get to the second and be like, I don't care. Or even skip ahead to understand how these pieces are going to come together out of frustration. But I just rolled with it. I really loved it. And at the same time, don't know who I would recommend it to, because I could see a lot of people finding it just not quite for them.
well, you can recommend it to me. I will read it.
Yeah,
eventually.
but anyone who likes literature with a capital L and Michael Lewis, right? So my dad loves Michael Lewis, but I don't think he would love this book. And hey, listeners, if it's for you and you do read it, you can let us know what you think.
I also read one of the Booker Longlistees. I read After Sappho by Selby Wynn Schwartz, which is a really, really interesting book. It's one of those books, and I love books like this, that very much is a blend of fiction and true life. It takes as its point of departure the poetry of the Greek poet Sappho. The name Sappho, just to me, conjures up this word, sapphism, meaning lesbianism. That was my association with it. And I loved the way that this reminded me, because what I really should know is that actually she was a poet, and these fragments of her poetry are all that remain to us now. But they tell a very particular story of a woman who was carving out her own space within Greek society and her own voice. And it's really hard to describe this book, but it's sort of echoing this idea of these fragments of poetry. It's written in fragments, and they are fragments from the lives of various female figures from history who have championed the cause of women, of feminism in various ways. And some of them I had never heard of. Lina Poletti, who is a Italian feminist, I didn't know anything about her. She's one of the main figures in it. But then Virginia Woolf features. Sometimes it's someone that you do know. And I love that with Woolf, for instance, it just so happened that recently I'd been doing a bit of a deep dive Bloomsbury anyway, because of the book that we covered for the podcast, Young Bloomsbury by Nino Strachey. So I was only recently emerged from that world. And as a result, when I got to the references to Woolf, I was able to place quite precisely the source material that Selby Wynn Schwartz was drawing on. And I found that really interesting, because in those rare moments, I was really able to see how she was interweaving Woolf's own words, Woolf's own writings, with her own invention. And that absolutely fascinated me, because she does it so beautifully. It's just a masterclass in this very particular kind of writing, which I don't think I've ever read before. I love that it wasn't like anything else I'd ever come across. It's quite academic in lots of ways, which I enjoyed, much like you were saying about trust. I enjoyed that about it. It really made me concentrate and it made me think. But also, it is just beautiful. There are moments of such kind of shivering beauty in odd sentences or phrases. And it's underpinned by this feminist story that, as a woman reader, I felt very invested in, and I really cared about it. And some things that I just didn't know just made me furious. I was like, oh my God, I can't believe that happened, or this was the law. There's a lot of stuff about structures in society and things that held women back, and then these various ways that these women attempted to change the sort of structures around them. I thought it was an absolutely wonderful read. I absolutely loved it. But I felt very conflicted about the fact that it had been longlisted for the Booker, because the Booker is a prize for fiction. And I've been down this road before, haven't I, with other books that blend fact and fiction in this way. I love books that do this. I have no problem with books that do this. And I think this is a wonderful book that I would recommend to anybody, and I think should win prizes. I just don't think it should win this prize. I don't think it should win the Booker Prize. And when it wasn't shortlisted, I thought, yeah, I agree with that. Even though I loved it, and I wouldn't be at all surprised if, I'm probably not going to read all of them, but I'm pretty sure it will remain an absolute favourite of mine. It's such a wonderful book.
Is it one for book clubs?
Yes, definitely. Although in that category of depending on what your book club is up for, it's not an easy read. In some ways, the writing is easy to read. The writing is, just as I said, just beautiful. She somehow manages to convey the level of beauty that comes from poetry, from Sappho's poetry, that infuses this whole book at the same time as incorporating, the writing and the voices of all of these different women. And it's such a polyphony, beautifully, beautifully woven together. I thought it was just a triumph. It's so well done.
I am disappointed it wasn't shortlisted because I'm not convinced I will read it unless it pops up as a book club choice, but it does sound fascinating. The book that I read first from the long list is The Trees by Percival Everett, and I have been effusive about this one ever since. What a book! It's on the shortlist. I haven't read every book on the shortlist, but this book is exhilarating. And I will be surprised if it doesn't win.
I thought you didn't like books about trees.
It's not about trees.
The Island of Missing Trees was a real problem for you.
It's not about trees. The Trees is a reference to the trees from which Black Americans were lynched. So we're talking about some really dark material. That's right in the name. And not only is it in the name, it's also in the cover treatment, at least the North American cover. You don't notice it right away, but underneath that, I think it's bright yellow, The Trees, it's a black background, but when you look more closely, and you can miss it, is a list of names of all the people who were murdered and lynched because of their race. And that list comes into the narrative. Percival Everett is the author. I've never heard of him. Apparently he's written over 30 books, and he is a professor of English at the University of Southern California. So, as we often say, our obliviousness until now may well just be because of, well, I'm now in Canada, but you and I were in the UK for a long time. Maybe he's just not such a known entity outside America. And hey, we can do a bit more research when we get to the shortlist episode. But I never heard of him, and I have no idea what his previous novels were like. And I'm so curious because this novel has this incredibly dry, hilarious tone. I feel like that's a bit of a curveball when I've just been talking about the subject matter. The premise is that these two Black detectives for the Mississippi Bureau of Investigation, the MBI, which is the subject of much ridicule throughout the story, have been sent to Money, Mississippi. And that's because a number of white men have been murdered. And alongside the body, so there's two separate murders, but let's talk to the first one. Alongside that body, this brutal murder, the man's been beaten to death in his own home, there is another body, and it's the body of a small Black man. And so the local white racist townsfolk and cops immediately assume that they've somehow beaten each other to death, even though the state of them indicates that would be impossible. And so these two bodies are taken into the coroner and put into deep freeze, whatever. And then the Black body disappears. And then another murder happens of another white man in Money, Mississippi. And the same Black man's body appears at the scene of the crime and then goes missing again. So the MBI are brought in to investigate what's going on. And as one might expect, their reception by the local white townsfolk and police and coroner are anything but welcome. But that dynamic is just incredibly funny. And the treatment of these white townsfolk is just essentially farcical. You're kind of baffled because initially I was like, why? Like, I love this, but why is this on the Booker long list? Because the tone is like a buddy cop drama. And the dialogue is really light and funny, and there's a lot of banter. And then it becomes something more complex and surprising because these murders begin to have copycat murders around the United States. And these two detectives, as well as a Black female FBI agent, are pulled into this investigation, even as things are kicking off across the rest of the country. And so what starts as a very focused cop caper becomes something very different. And it's exhilarating, as I've said, and it's funny. and it's surprising, and I loved it, and I've given it to my parents and they loved it, and I think you're going to love it, Kate. I don't know how anyone couldn't love this book. It's so exciting.
Well, that's then presumably why it made the shortlist.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. But you don't know what you're reading.
Interesting. Okay. Well, I am looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to it a lot more than I'm looking forward to Treacle Walker, which I understand to be challenging.
Yeah. Should we just, hey, we're finished, I think, with our summer reading, aren't we? Unless you want to confess to anything guilty. I have one guilty pleasure to mention.
Oh, yeah. What did you read?
Well, I feel like the obvious question is, where's the fantasy? Because that's what I read for my guilty pleasure reading. And so I will confess that I am about 600 pages in of a 900-page novel, which is the second in the Lies of Locke Lamora series, Red Seas Under Red Skies. It's pretty terrible. Scott Lynch needs an editor to just kill a third of his plot, but it's very fun. It's very silly. I've kind of slipped it in as a palate cleanser after all my Booker Prize reading.
I'm looking forward to diving into the shortlist. I have only read the Claire Keegan.
Oh, goodness. You gotta get going.
So I've got lots of work to do. I don't really know anything about any of the others. I haven't even properly looked them up. So, can't wait. My mind's gone blank about what else I did read. I read a lot over the summer, but I can't think what else. I got stuck for ages on this Barbara Pym novel. I can't remember the title of. That took me about a week. Talk about Lonesome Dove being a long novel. The Barbara Pym novel, which was probably only about 300 pages, felt like eternity. I was happy to have read it, but I just really did get bogged down with it and thought at one point it was never going to end, but it did. Listeners, Laura had to go to an afternoon meeting. It's lunchtime out in Vancouver, where she is, leaving just me to tell you about one other book I read over the summer, and that was a debut novel called Housebreaking by Colleen Hubbard. It was a great page-turner that had me very happily absorbed, but I also thought it had some interesting themes that might make it a good pick for book club. I caught up with Colleen over Zoom to hear more about it.
Housebreaking is about a young woman called Dell. She's 24 years old. Both of her parents have died. Her life, basically, to this point, has been structured around desperately not trying to go back to her hometown. She is living in a city several hours away from her hometown. And for various reasons, she has to go back to deal with a property that she inherited from her parents. And when she's back there, her first impulse is to flee. But for various reasons, she can't. She has to stay. And it's about a choice that she makes while she's there, which is to physically dismantle the house, take it apart, not just empty it out as you would if you were a moving house, but actually take the house apart nail by nail.
Reading it, one of the things that struck me is how difficult it is to take apart a house. It's kind of like a sort of anti-DIY novel in a way.
Yeah. I have to say that I had no idea how to dismantle a house when I decided I was going to write a book about dismantling a house. I have zero DIY skills. If there's anything ever broken in my house, I am not the go-to person to fix it. I knew that I wanted to write a book about someone who physically moves a house. And I thought, okay, I'm just going to start going and write. And then I realized that I didn't have the basic information on how to do that. So I actually interviewed a person who professionally dismantles houses. He does it for recycling purposes, basically. Normally, if a house is in bad shape, it gets knocked down. It basically gets thrown away. And there is a man called Brad Guy who runs a company that is about material reuse. He's an architect. And he goes on site and dismantles houses, and he reuses everything that is possible to reuse. I contacted him and said, can you just walk me through how to dismantle a house? When I first told him I was writing a book, I think he might have assumed that I might have been an architect, or I might have had some sort of background or know anything about buildings. And so I think he was quite surprised in our first call when I said, yeah, so if I hit a wall with a hammer, what would I see? And he had to talk me through everything from selecting the style of the house that she lived in and how that would reflect her home, her family, the amount of money that they had, but also where they live. He helped me basically choose the house. I went and found online the house that I wanted to base it on. And that way he could look at it and say, okay, well, if you hit a wall with a hammer, this is what would be behind the wall of this house.
I read an article that you wrote about your own story, your own childhood, your own experiences of losing your family home at quite a young age. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
When I was 10 years old, our house was repossessed. So something that I didn't know was happening. I went away on a trip with my siblings, came back, and we were told, actually, we don't live in that house anymore. And we never went back there. From that point, we lived in homeless shelter from August until December when we moved into an apartment. But there was definitely that sense of fracture, of there being this, I think a level of family lore that happens in every house where you have the things that you know. And in my house growing up, there was always this argument between my parents about whether we had a trash disposal in the sink, which is this button that you press that grinds up everything. I think I haven't seen it in any UK houses. They may exist, but basically cuts up everything that goes in your sink.
I think we have them. I think it's called a garburator. A
garburator. Yeah, well, they would fight all the time. They had been divorced for years, and they would argue about whether or not we had a garburator or not. But they're just those things that you take for granted when you live in a place and then are suddenly gone from you when you move away. And there were no goodbyes. And I never had that chance, which the woman does in the book, of going back and looking at things again and coming to an adult understanding about something that she didn't quite understand when she was a child.
And I love the way that you explore the memories that can be contained within spaces and within objects, and then the context of those objects. So, within a house, they are one thing. In the course of this novel, what happens as the house is taking apart is that the objects get dispersed and they become something else. And I love the way, on the one hand, they're just sort of junk. They're not needed anymore. But on the other hand, they have this resonance. Another thing that I love that you tapped into was the idea, the way that children see objects, the idea about finding these things in the woods like a hairbrush. And to an adult, it looks like rubbish or something to avoid. But to a child, it's a kind of magical thing. And I love that because I have memories. I grew up on a farm and I have memories of playing with my friends when we were young. There was this big open area that was called the dump, and
the dump.
Now it would be like a rewilding
yeah.
space, and it's still there. It's owned by some aggregate company. They don't do anything with it. It will just sort of sit there. People go and ride motorbikes around it, but it's full of all these objects, mainly Victorian pill bottles and things like that.
Fascinating.
And we would find things,
and it seemed like magic.
Play with them, and
yeah,
it did.
Yeah.
It really did. And I love that in this book, the way that it's you've got these characters, but also you've got these objects, and it felt really rich.
Yeah, there's a sense that she's creating a new history. She has to become an adult in the book. She's gone from leaving this house and leaving her family when she was 17 to now being 24, coming back. And in some ways, she's in this state of suspended adolescence. She refuses to stick with a job. She has no money. She doesn't behave like an adult in many ways that we would demand a 24-year-old behave like an adult. And she is sort of that annoying, teenage, churlish person, and she has to deal with herself at a fundamental level. And some of that is looking through her parents' objects and thinking of her parents differently than the way that she did. But also, as you say, she takes these objects and she disperses them and she leaves them behind. And they're going to be found by other people, other children, other adolescents who just happen to be walking around in the woods. And they're going to mean something different to those people than they meant to her. And so she leaves behind a special cup that belonged to her parents or a book. And she isn't intending to leave artifacts. It's not an intentional thing, but she's aware at the same time the kids who are moving into the new development that is going to be built will find these things, and they're going to treat them like treasure in a way that I think I did, the same way that you did when I was a little kid, when I found things that felt like for some reason they were just a bit special, that meant something to me.
And the other thing that interested me is the way that a lot of Del's relationships are with older people, kind of intergenerational friendships, which intrigued me. Mm-hmm. Why did you want to give her those relationships?
I think for me, one, she's somebody who seems very much like she wants to be, and she feels she is on the fringes of society. The town that she's living in is never named, but it is Boston, Massachusetts. I think that if you were from Boston, you would recognize it. Boston is very much a college town. And I was thinking about this 24-year-old woman who dropped out of high school, is working these fringe jobs, is quitting jobs all the time. And she just wouldn't easily fit into the society of people her own age, because the people who are her own age would have been planning to travel the world, go backpacking, or they would be starting their jobs in PR. And she just doesn't have anything to offer a friendship like that. She doesn't speak the same language as those people. Whereas I think really the pressure on her life in this book is that she is suffering a really deep and unresolved grief. And there are older people in the book who understand that based on their own experiences. And so they have common ground in a way that she doesn't have common ground with another 22, 23, 24-year-old.
Yeah, I love those friendships. They were great. Another thing that really delighted me, having finished and enjoyed this book, was that then I got the extra treat of this great book list that you included at the back. I don't know whether they were particularly inspirational books or just books that you really liked.
Just books I loved.
What was you thinking about? Yeah.
They said you could write anything you want for the last section. I can't think of what I'd rather do than talk about books that I love. I love books so much. And when I read a book that I love, I just want everybody to read it. And so the idea, I'm essentially going to be paid to tell people about books that I like, overwhelmed me. And I spent a lot of time coming up with that list.
I love the list. It's a great list. I wanted to read all of them, but I was particularly intrigued by The Magician of Lublin by Isaac Bashevis Singer, which I had never heard of. I'd heard of him, but I'd never heard of that book.
This is one of the most beautiful books that I've read in my life, and it came to me. It's one of those books that felt like it was meant for me. I had my first child, and I had really bad postpartum depression. I just was not a functioning member of society for a while. And when I bought this book was the first time after having my baby that I was able to leave the house on my own. I went on a walk and I ended up at a used bookstore, and I talked to the person who worked at this used bookstore, and they recommended this book to me. I think I paid £1.50 for it, and it felt like medicine. It is a book about a man who has to come to terms with his life. He's a magician who travels through what I think is Poland, but Poland of a long time ago before it was called Poland. And he has a mistress in every town. And then something happens that forces him to reconsider what it means to live an honest life and be an honest man. And he has to make big changes. And the sense of magic, of honesty, of wisdom, of what it means to be mature and grow up and be honest with yourself about who you are is something that was really meaningful to me at the time. And it's just a book. Also, I have to say, when I first had my baby, I only loved to read books that were really short, like 200 pages or less. I love a really tightly written, efficient narrative, and it is that. I recommend it to everybody. I hadn't read his novels before, and now I'm trying to read all of them, but I think The Magician of Lublin will remain one of my favorite books of all time forever.
Oh, thank you. Well, thank you for the recommendation. Thank you for talking to us about Housebreaking. And yeah, I look forward to everyone reading it and discovering it for themselves. That's nearly it for this episode. Books mentioned were Lonesome Dove by Larry McMurtry, The Night Always Comes by Willie Vlortin, After Sappho by Selby Wynn Schwartz, Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin, Trust by Hernan Diaz, The Trees by Percival Everett, Housebreaking by Colleen Hubbard, and The Magician of Lublin by Isaac Bashevis Singer. Whenever you listen to the episode, whether it's at the time we publish it or sometime in the future, if you have thoughts and want to share them, you can do so anytime in the comments forum over at our episode page on our website, thebookclubreview.co.uk. That's where you'll also find full show notes on the books we discussed, plus a transcript. And if you're hungry for more, that's also where you'll find our archive of over 100 other episodes, from book prize specials to overlooked classics. This episode was produced and edited by me, Kate LONESOME. Laura and I are putting our Patreon page together, but if you know anything about us, it's that we like to get things just so before we put them out into the world. So we'll be sharing the details for that in a future episode. We're so looking forward to the extra things we're going to be able to bring you on there. In the meantime, for book recommendations between episodes, do follow us on Instagram or Facebook at Book Club Review Podcast, on Twitter at Book Club RVW Pod, or email thebookclubreview@gmail.com. And if you're not already, please don't forget to subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also support us by taking a moment to rate and review the show, which helps other listeners find us. Your recommendation is the best possible way for us to reach new people, which we love to do, so please do help us spread the word. But for now, until next time, thanks for listening and happy reading.